Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Ruth Melkonian Hoover. I'm a professor of political science and international affairs here at Gordon, and I am really grateful that you have joined us here today. I think you are in for a very good conversation. Given that this fall marks the 400th anniversary of the first Thanksgiving, the harvest celebration meals shared by the Pilgrim settlers in the Wampanoag and Plymouth, we are here to consider and reconsider Thanksgiving celebrations in America, central to our identity and narrative, and I think it's a good lens through which to understand the influence that history and historical memory play in our contemporary American culture and politics. For some, Thanksgiving is a day of rejoicing, a day to give thanks for our nation, for our families, our friends, or the harvest. For others, it's a day to come together at the Thanksgiving table, to break bread, perhaps overindulge their appetites. For some, it's a day of mourning and lament. And today we come to listen, to reason together, to learn, and to consider how best to engage this day as people of faith who seek God's will in all of this. I also want today to thank the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities, they are supporting this grant via an initiative for networking Christian scholars. This grant also supports a new special issue of the Review of Faith and International Affairs on Thanksgiving, guest edited by Matt Rowley. A limited number of copies are available in the lobby for you. And I also want to thank my colleagues on the leadership team of this project, Matt Rowley, Sung Chang Ra, and Judd Bertzel. And thanks to Bonnie Ross, our extraordinary division coordinator here at Gordon College, who pulled this together in a time of COVID and myriad technical challenges. Wow. And now, to our panel. Let me introduce you to our moderator, Jennifer Hevelin Harper, who will then introduce our panelists. Jennifer is the Phillips Loring Endowed Chair in History and Chair of the Department of Political Science, Philosophy, and History here at Gordon, where she teaches courses in medieval, Byzantine, and early Islamic history and co-directs the Jerusalem-Athens Forum, a Great Books honors program. She completed her undergraduate work here at Gordon and received an MA from the University of Chicago and a PhD from Princeton. Thank you, Jennifer.
It's a pleasure to see so many faces in this audience. How wonderful to be gathered together in person for such an event. I'm going to introduce our speakers one at a time as they come to the podium. And so it's my great pleasure first to welcome Dr. Matthew Rowley to Gordon College. Dr. Rowley is an honorary visiting fellow at the University of Leicester and a historian of early modern religion and violence. After his PhD, he worked on research projects at the University of Cambridge and Leicester. His first book, Trump and the Protestant Reaction to Make America Great Again, published by Routledge in 2021, examined how Americans reckon with historical racism, sexism, and exploitation. He recently edited another volume entitled Miracles, Political Authority and Violence in Medieval and Early Modern History, also from Routledge. And he is currently editing a 2-volume global source book in Protestant political thought, 1517 to 1914. Thank you, Matt Rowley, and welcome to Gordon.
Thank you. I'm going to put this down. On October 11th, 1889, Bishop Benjamin William Arnett addressed a large crowd at Chicago's Music Hall who were gathering for an autumnal festival. At this point, Arnett was one of the most influential African Americans in the United States. He had already served as a university lecturer, a historian of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, a bishop of that church, and also as a representative of the Ohio legislature. In 1896, he was the chaplain of the Republican National Convention. He was also a longtime friend and advisor to President William McKinley, and when McKinley was sworn into office in 1897, the president placed his hand on a Bible given by Arnett. Arnett was also a vigorous and unapologetic expansionist. He preached the gospel of American expansionism at the crucial moment when the nation was transitioning from a landed nation into an overseas empire. America should expand, he argued. God was making it expand. At this 1899 autumnal festival, Arnett said the following to the crowd. The question is often asked, are you in favor of expansionism? How could I be any other than an expansionist? The only condition that I have is that the expansion is based on the principles of the civilization of Plymouth Rock, and rather than on the principles represented by Jamestown. All that I ask is that the darker children who are to be invited to come to our Commonwealth, that they should be given their seat at the table with the other children of Uncle Sam. America's greatness, he argued, was fundamentally an interracial greatness. And because the principles of Plymouth led Americans to promote rights and equality and progress, the nation must expand into the territories of the people of color. I begin this conference with Bishop Arnett to illustrate a simple point. Historical persons are complex. Wherever you look in history, particularly American history, you will find compelling, curious, and sometimes criminal uses of the American past. Just as modern generations critique Arnett's use of Plymouth to justify conquest, so future generations will critique us in 21, and they will wonder, how in the world did we think that our polarized versions of history were the gospel truth? An awareness of what Mark Knoll calls the pendulum effects of American history should make historians humble about the past and the present. And I believe that curiosity, humility, self-critique are essential toolkits for amateur and professional historians. Arnett asked that the darker children in distant lands be given their seat at the table with Uncle Sam. At this conference, we'll be discussing and debating Uncle Sam's Thanksgiving table. In the copy of the Review of Faith and International Affairs that is available out there, I describe at length one famous depiction of that feast, illustrated above. History, Thanksgiving, and immigration constructively collided in an iconic illustration by Thomas Nast for Harper's Weekly. Nast sketched a capacious vision for post-Civil War America, one in which all races, all genders, all ages, and all religions could sit down and enjoy the feast of self-government at Uncle Sam's table. I won't describe all the details here, but the picture prompts some fundamental questions. If we think of the nation as a table, perhaps a Thanksgiving one, who belongs around it? Who is the host and who the guest? What are the criteria for inclusion and who gets to decide? As we debate these things, we must never forget that the wood for the table was carved of wood from Native American forests, sits squarely on their ancestral lands, and they are seated at the table, demanding a voice. Thanksgiving is one of America's most inclusive holidays, but it's also one of its most divisive. On that day, shouts of gratitude intermingle with cries of mourning. Thanksgiving is a welcoming feast prepared on someone else's ancestral lands. These differing reactions to Thanksgiving have their roots in colonial history. Those who fondly remember Thanksgiving often focus on the 1621 event, a day of harmony and joyful gratitude. It was a time of harmony between two vulnerable peoples who came together at that moment. Those who mourn Thanksgiving focus on how colonial history unfolded, becoming a story of violence and exclusion. This complex history is not a feature to be ignored. Rather, complexity is something to be embraced. As Amanda Gorman said in her Inauguration Day poem that transformed John Winthrop's City on a Hill into the hill that we climb, being American is more than a pride we inherit. It's a past we step into and how we repair it. This conference is an attempt to step into that mixed historical inheritance, but also to bring about repair. With hindsight, it seems unsurprising that the latter part of Donald Trump's presidency featured fierce battles over historical memory. When it came to modern politics, both sides accused the other of fake news, and the same accusation was hurled when they talked about history. As several contributors to the special collection note, the left praised the 1619 Project, and it differed markedly from the 1776 Commission that was praised by the right. Both sides argued that their account accurately represented the past. Both sides denounced those offering any criticisms of their version of history. Both believed that their version of history bolstered justice in the present. Perhaps supporters of both sides were so closely linked with political parties that conceding on any little historical details felt like conceding an election. Supporters of the 1776 Commission celebrate the Thanksgiving event as a day of harmony and gratitude, while supporters of the 1619 Project lament the violence and exclusion that followed in its wake. In a forthcoming book, Flag and Cross, Philip Gorski and Samuel Perry position their approach between the 1619 Project and the 1776 Commission. It's much closer to the former, although they differ from both. They write, "Whereas the 1619 Project sees continuity and causality, we see contingency and complexity. In 1619, a more inclusive and egalitarian society was still possible, if not probable." The 1619 Project tends to see modern problems as baked into the nation from the beginning. In this interpretation, the next 400 years of white supremacy unfold with unstoppable force. This can lead to a crippling fatalism in the present and apathy and inaction. Because America's racial history has not changed in 400 years, they argue, hopes for progress should not be set too high. Gorski and Perry see far more contingency and complexity in how American history turned out. And recognizing this contingency hopefully leads to recognizing that racism in the present is also contingent. We can, as a nation, choose a better path. In contrast to the 1776 Commission, Gorski and Perry write, "Where it saw rupture and novelty, we see continuity and repetition. At four key moments, history could have taken a different path. The early colonial era, the founding of the Republic, Reconstruction after the Civil War, and the Civil Rights era. At each moment, real possibilities for a more inclusive America were on the table." I've argued elsewhere that increased historical reflection actually contributes to our polarization in America. It drives us apart the more we think about history. Yet as a historian, I also hope that history can bridge some of this divide. To accomplish this, Americans need more overlap in what we remember about the past. Shared memory will not erase political differences, but it might make debate more civil, enlightening, and productive. Americans from across the political spectrum need to become more adept at confessing the past and connecting the dots. So when I speak about confessing the past, I'm not talking about a confession of guilt. Sometimes confessions of guilt are necessary, as when somebody might confess their role in stirring anti-Islamic hatred after 9/11. For my purposes here, confession of history is more like a confession of faith. A confession of faith does not claim to create truth. It assents to truth. In the same way, a person confessing the fact assents to the fact that these things happened. Land theft happened. Slavery happened. Internment camps happened. Confession acknowledges that these things and many more happened in history, and that they belong to the narrative that Americans tell about themselves. But the problem is Americans fundamentally disagree about what elements should form the national memory. They disagree over what to remember and what to forget, and both sides remember and forget different things. In a recent book, I explore 3 approaches to American history, particularly when that history relates to racism, sexism, and exploitation. Those who praise the 1619 Project tend to fear that claims to American greatness paper over a long history of injustice. I call this the Make America Lament approach to history. Perhaps more significantly, they fear that injustice in the present rages unchecked because injustice in the past is unconfronted. Their approach to history emphasizes the negative, almost to the exclusion of anything positive. They want to unravel self-congratulatory narratives and myths so that the nation can move forward towards justice and equality for all for the first time. They seem unwilling to confess the good in American history, lest this short-circuit the process of national repentance. And they tend to experience change as progress, viewing maintainers of the status quo as obstacles to a more diverse and inclusive America. In contrast to this view of history, those who praise the 1776 Commission see the document as a defense of a noble and inspiring past, what I call the Make America Great Again approach to history. In this view, opponents on the left who challenge the past are interpreted as hell-bent on destroying and defacing everything good in the American past. If the left succeeds, they argue, the right and their history will become refugees. Or as 2 recent titles put it, they will be strangers in their own land, or the left behind. This side fears that criticism of the past will devolve into destruction, indiscriminately consuming the good with the bad. Therefore, this side is reluctant to confess anything bad in American history. They tend to experience change as a loss, both cultural and religious. And Trump gave voice to this sense of loss, and more importantly, he promised to do something about it. As this brief illustration shows, Make America Lament advocates are willing to confess the bad in American history, but not willing to confess the good. Make America Great Again advocates are willing to confess the good, but have a hard time confessing the bad. However, there's a third group, and I think actually the majority, that I call the Make America Better approach to history. This group agrees that Americans need to lament, and lament deeply. Lament is the only proper response to a history of racism, sexism, and land dispossession. However, they take a crucial step beyond lament. And this is to embrace what is best in American history. In confessing the bad about the past, they also confess the good. And confessing the good involves placing historical persons and ideas in context. It looks for historical progress and notes how the struggle for justice and equality in the present is animated by the ideals of the past, however hypocritical or short-sighted the people originally espousing those ideas were. Proponents of the Make America Better approach to history come from both sides of the political aisle. Perhaps Barack Obama is a leading proponent of this approach. He's critical of failures, but by confessing the good in American history, he tries to push Americans to live up to their high ideals. In a recent podcast, he says the following, Lincoln is at the center of what I think about as America, and my reverence for him does not mean that I don't recognize his many failures. One of the hardest things, whether it's as an adult or in our own lives or as a nation, is figuring out it's possible for you to see the wrong in people without negating everything about them. It's possible for you to look at the Founding Fathers and say, yeah, they were slaveholders, and then also say, but man, that Declaration of Independence is something. Examples from Obama's presidency are too numerous to detail, but I'll give one more from his 2015 remarks at the 50th anniversary of the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. So he uses phrases like this about the difference between the ideal America and the real America. Selma was a contest to determine the true meaning of America. The idea of America, a fair America, an inclusive America, a generous America, ultimately triumphed. What greater form of patriotism is there than the belief that America is not yet finished? It is in our power to remake this nation to more closely align with our highest ideals. And finally, we must do what we can to make America better. In addition to confessing the past, which we've already discussed, we need to become more skilled at connecting the dots. This is connecting the dots between the past and the present. The past, the bad and the good, is not quarantined from the present. America's enduring failures and our successes are owing to the past. To connect the past and the present, three things are necessary. We need a knowledge of the distant past, we need a knowledge of the present, and we need a knowledge of the events in between. It's very common sense, but we kind of forget this. Americans need to become more familiar with more parts of our history. Consider Native American history. Pocahontas and Plymouth loom large. Most Americans know that there were colonial wars, but the details are sketchy. Indigenous peoples pop up again during the Trail of Tears and also during memories of the Wild West. But American Indians recede into the memory landscape and run casinos until seemingly out of nowhere they are protesting the construction of a pipeline in the Dakotas. In other words, most Americans have only a hazy picture of Native American history. However, dynamic and diverse Native American communities have been an essential part of pre-colonial, colonial, and United States history at every stage. How can white Americans hope to foster fairness towards these Americans if we forget most of their history? Similarly, we should consider present-day disparities between many modern African Americans and many modern whites alongside accounts from America's deep past, particularly forced immigration, chattel slavery, and Jim Crow. But what connects modern disparities with the deep past? Anyone familiar with all the dates that I put up there on the screen know that they're very important dates in the history of race relations in America. But what connects them? Susan Neiman has argued that most white Americans have a century-long memory gap. Quote, "There are several reasons for American slowness in facing our history, and one is fairly simple. There's a 100-year hole in it. And few white Americans are even aware of that. For most of us, the period between the 1863 Emancipation Proclamation and the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott is a vague and cloudy blur. Surely white Americans know what happened to white Americans during that time period, but much of what the African American community did and what was done to them is forgotten. Recovering this history reconnects past and present. Never before have we been blessed with so many good historical resources for connecting the dots between the past and the present. Let us not waste these historical works by using them for partisan ends. History brings us face to face with persons, ideas, and events that are both uncomfortable and inspiring. I like to talk of standing in awe of history, and you can stand in awe of a saint or a swindler. Most persons in the past and the present are somewhere in between. Recovering a complex history may help us bridge polarization so that the push for justice and equality in the present can be a bipartisan effort. However, nations, like people, often resist discussing family history, particularly because families know where all the fault lines are in the relationship. It's often said that politics and religion should not be discussed in polite company. Will history be the third thing that won't be named around the table at Thanksgiving? If national self-reflection and critique are framed as a sign of national maturity, then perhaps discussions will be productive. In closing, I want to leave you with the question I posed earlier. If we think of the nation as a table, perhaps a Thanksgiving one, who belongs around it? Who is the host and who the guest? What are the criteria for inclusion and who gets to decide? History may not give us all the answers to this question, but I can't help but feeling that wrestling with these questions would do our nation a lot of good. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Richard Pickering. Richard Pickering is the Deputy Executive Director at Plymouth Pawtuxet Museums, which I had the privilege of taking a group of students to a little bit earlier this semester. Richard has been with the museums for more than 30 years and brings a wealth of insight gained from a variety of positions, projects, and research at Plymouth Pawtuxet. He has spoken at the United Nations and Smithsonian National Museum of American History. He has appeared on NPR, PBS, the History Channel, NECN, NBC News, and several other venues. He has also worked on Rick Burns' film, The Pilgrims, for American Experience. Welcome, Richard.
Hello, everyone. It's so good to be back at Gordon again. Today, I spent much of the afternoon with students studying at the Naval War College, because for the last 3 or 4 years, the Command College and the Staff College have come to the museum as part of their 2 years of study in this country. So today I said to the commanding officer, how many countries are represented in the group visiting today? And he said, Richard, there are 54 countries in the room. And they are people who come from around the world to study the United States, our history, and our regional cultures, and to spend time together that they build relationships. Because I said to the commanding officer when they first started coming, why do you come here? And he said, Richard, there have been incident after incidents of violence that have been prevented by this program because these young men and women who are now 7 or 10 years into their careers, later, when they are leaders of countries, leaders of their militaries, they can call one another and say, really? You're really going to do that? He said 2 of my students are rear admirals, and when there was going to be trouble in the Indian Ocean, they were able to pick up the phone and calm it down because they remembered time that they had spent together. Today, for the first time, the Naval War College chose to dine at the museum, a dinner called Taste of Two Cultures, which has some indigenous food and colonial food. So while I was with them, and these were diplomats, military leaders, and their families, there were about 90 people altogether, I said, you're here at an auspicious time that 400 years ago in the fall, the first Thanksgiving happened, and you heard an audible sigh throughout the entire room, and then smiles. And I said, what I want you to think about where you are seated is the very southernmost point of Plymouth in 1627. You are sitting where the cornfields ended, and you're just 2 miles away from where that original harvest feast happened. And what I would like you to think about is who was there. Because in that fall of 1621, when communities came together, there were only 52 English men, women, and children. Half of those 52 under the age of 18. In the 3 days that they spent with the Pokanoket, there were 90 native men that had come with Sachem Massasoit. And in the only eyewitness account of the event, Edward Winslow tells us, many Indians coming amongst us, and among them, their greatest king, Massasoit, with 90 men. So it is entirely possible that there were other sachemships there as well. Imagine the numbers. And no one could speak to each other. Out of all of those people, only Tisquantum and Hobbamock and possibly a man by the name of Toka Muhammad could speak both languages. And yet for 3 days they were able to reach towards one another, to feast together, to play sports, to share military demonstrations and share gifts one with another. We need to remember that these were communities that were fragile, that from 1616 to 1618, epidemics swept from what is now Portland, Maine, to the border between Massachusetts and Rhode Island. And in the course of 16 to 18 months, upwards of 90% of the indigenous population of coastal New England was gone. Gone. So you have one community that has experienced death that even dwarfs the numbers of the Black Death when you think of it in percentage terms, and another that has seen half of its community gone. But yet they are able to reach towards one another with a sense of realpolitik. Let's not infantilize or romanticize this. These communities came together because they could help one another. And I said to the men and women that were sitting at the museum this afternoon, that is exactly what you're doing. And when I had to go off to my next speaking engagement, the commanding officer followed me outside on the deck and grabbed me by the hand and said, "Richard, that's exactly what they needed to hear. That was the message related to our visit." So in the time that we have together, what I want to do is reimagine who was at the first Thanksgiving, looking at the written account that we've had so far and put it against the archaeological record that's coming out of the earth. The museum and UMass Boston for the last 10 years have been digging downtown Plymouth, and it is bringing people back into the story whose presence was questioned. Our garden curator has been doing experiments over the last couple of years in growing corn in the Wampanoag manner of corns and beans and squash together and looking at its ramifications on how those communities were connected one to another. Because you need to remember that no one in Plymouth had ever seen maize before except for one Mayflower passenger. Stephen Hopkins had been part of the shipwreck in 1609 that inspired Shakespeare's The Tempest. He was on the island for a year and then was in Jamestown for 3 years, so he would have seen maize. He was possibly the one that told them to steal it from native barns at the tip of Cape Cod. They would not have known what to do with that without constant native counsel. So I'm going to do something. I never speak with documents, but we're going to start here. For those of you that study your history, you know that there were competing calendars in 1621, that Protestant Europe would not follow the calendar reforms of the Catholic Church. And so though Catholic countries started the year January 1st, Protestant nations until the 18th century were starting their calendars on March 25th, Lady Day. Traditionally, the day the Holy Spirit came to the Virgin Mary. So when any English writings are done of the 17th century, they start March 25th and end March 24th. That's the year. What you are looking at is the 1621 page from New England's Memorial, the first full-length history of Plymouth that was written by Governor William Bradford's nephew, Nathaniel Morton. What I want you to think about is that he begins this material completely out of order. And he puts an event, he puts an event that happened September 13th, 1621. It is the beginning of his treatment of the year. And what he tells us is that on September 13th, 1621, there were 9 sachems or their representatives at Plymouth to continue the conversations of mutual peace and alliance that had been started by Massasoit in March of 1621. When Massasoit made his first appearance to the English, he came with 60 men. He brought a train to impress them with his power and with his prestige. And during that day of negotiation, at the end of the day, the English said to him, "Would you go to other sachemships They perceived he was a king, so they thought he was going to princes reporting to him, when actually he had no power over other sachems. He was going to have to do influential diplomacy. But in September, there were 7 sachems with 2 sachems sending diplomatic representatives. Now, if you think about the fact that sachems typically traveled with trains of men to exhibit their power, exhibit their importance, you may now have those same 52 men, women, and children surrounded by several hundred native men, and there is no sense of conflict, there is no sense of danger. But as Matt has talked about, there are those that will lament, there are those that will only see conflict, and they find that is the drama of history, is the conflict. And what I would charge us all with today is that we not look at the first Thanksgiving in terms of those that were celebrating the first Thanksgiving after the closing of the American West, when Turner closed it, and it was perceived that Native peoples had been suppressed and decimated. And so now you could have this bucolic outside feast. The challenge I give you is that we return to the diplomatic excellence of that harvest feast of 1621, which was evocative of communities doing deep listening and the hard work of getting along. So as I talk, let this event hover over you, that the first Thanksgiving is not a single event. Again and again, communities were reaching towards one another, no matter how difficult it was, because they could benefit each other. The other person that I'm going to ask to be in the room with us is one of the great Wampanoag historians who was my mentor, a man we lost at the young age of 41, but who left a massive amount of work, by the name of Nanepashemet. So many of my perceptions of Native history are Nanepashemet's. They are not mine, and I want to keep his memory alive. Most scholars working in 17th century indigenous history of southern New England, they begin in Nanepashemet's archives. So think about this event, September 13th, 1621, all of those people together. Now, this is from William Bradford's manuscript. In 1630, he picked up the pen and started writing a history of the Plymouth colony. And we all thought we could make this very exciting announcement that, wow, September 13th, 1621 might have been the first Thanksgiving, because it matches with what Edward Winslow describes in his letter from December of that year. No way. When you look at Bradford, what he says is that after this, the 18th of September, they sent out their shallop to the Massachusetts with 10 men and Squanto for their guide. So the first Thanksgiving could not have happened yet because the harvest has not yet been gathered in. So at the top of the page, Bradford is describing a trip made by 10 men with Tisquantum as their guide. That means in Plymouth, there are only 10 men defending that colony. There is a sense that the diplomacy is working and they are in no danger, and they can travel and for the first time make relations with indigenous people to the north that they've not yet encountered. In the middle paragraph, what Bradford is telling us is they now began to fit up their houses for winter and to gather in their harvest. And for those of you that might have heard the misinformation, there was no turkey at the first Thanksgiving, the entire middle paragraph is about the abundance of turkeys in the fall of 1621. I just took part, I was an advisor on the Smithsonian Channel's new documentary on the history of Thanksgiving, and at some point in the interview I said, it cracks me up to think of the pilgrims going out fowling and saying to themselves, I cannot shoot the iconic bird, the turkey. Because it's just that turkey was at the meal, it just wasn't the center of the meal. So we know that the harvest was coming in, and the only eyewitness account that has survived of the first Thanksgiving is a letter that was written by Edward Winslow on December 13th, 1621. And the only reason it has survived, it was captured by French pirates. So Robert Cushman goes back on the second vessel, and he is given a manuscript by William Bradford that is intended to be the first advertisement of the colony. But in the English Channel, the ship Fortune is captured by French pirates who take Robert Cushman and the crew to this small island no bigger than Martha's Vineyard off the coast of Poitou. And while they are being held in dungeons, the Marquis of the island calls for all of the documents that were on the ship. And so there was an English speaker. The manuscript was read to the Marquis, who found it so delightful he wouldn't give it back. So now Robert Cushman has the responsibility of creating an advertising tract, and what he does is he violates people's trust, and he prints their private letters to put some more pages in the pamphlet he has to create. So this is the only way that our knowledge of the event survives. William Bradford never writes about it. He only writes about the season. What I want you to look at is this letter. We're going to go back and forth in the letter. It's 4 pages long, and it's one solid paragraph. And I say, oops, let me go back. And I say to the staff, please, if you can, don't let an editor get in the way of you and the record. Be there with the writer. If it's in manuscript form, struggle through it if you can. And all of you may, in the readings that you've done about Thanksgiving, know the very famous paragraph, our harvest being gotten in, our 4 men, our governor sent 4 men on fowling, and they, in a few hours, got enough waterfowl to serve the entire company for a week. That's here. Oops, sorry. That's here, embedded in this page. In 1841, the pamphlet was printed for the first time since 1622, and the editor, a Unitarian minister by the name of Alexander Young, broke it into traditional paragraphs, and since that time, that has been the mode in which we know this holiday. Around it, what gets lost is Edward Winslow's commenting on the native people, saying, they're in our houses, we're in their houses, we go back and forth, we are very friendly one with the other. That gets lost. How do we date this? I told you about September 18th. That is the beginning of the possibility of the date range. So September 18th, they go off to Massachusetts. They are back by Saturday afternoon, the 22nd, so they can worship on Sunday, the 23rd. The first Thanksgiving might have been the 24th, or anywhere from September 24th to November 9th, when the second ship arises. One of the wonders of what's coming out of archaeology is that it is showing us that native people are on the other side of Town Brook the first year. So the English, you've heard the story of Tisquantum teaching the English how to plant corn, completely true. Completely true. But now let's fold native women and children into the story, because the night Massasoit comes for the first discussions, he goes back to John Carver in the evening and he says, our wives and our women are in the woods, and we will be back in 8 or 9 days to plant corn on the other side of the brook. Women have never been in the imagination of the first Thanksgiving before. It has only been the 90 Pokanoket men. The archaeology is showing that the Pokanoket are there. And so in the first year, planters are able to look across to the Pokanoket women and their children working the corn and learning from them. They are watching when it is ready to come in. They are watching how to process the ears. It is nothing that English people could have done before. What we are learning from the practice of 17th century or ancient Wampanoag planting is we are able to now suggest that the first Thanksgiving happens somewhere from the 1st to 2nd week of October based on watching the patterns of corn coming in. You may have also heard that there was no invitation, that native people just showed up, that they came in response to gunfire, and that is not true. That the 4 men sent on fowling were not an anachronism. They were not unusual. In hunting season, the governor sent out 2 men every day to supplement tables with waterfowl, with turkeys, and with venison. 4 is just double the number of the usual daily hunting that's going on. It's entirely possible that this was a high-end diplomatic event at which we are told King Massasoit and his 90 men, the other sachemships are there. 3 days, they are able to confirm relationships made in March. And in closing, what I want us to remember is it's a lot of work. It is a lot of work to maintain diplomatic excellence, to be face-to-face even when it's inconvenient, and to keep talking even when there is difference. Nana Pashmet said to me when I was a young man, Richard, let the first Thanksgiving live on its own. He said, in the immediate jump to King Philip's War and the tragedy of the violence of 1675 to 1676, what gets lost is the excellence and power of Massasoit's leadership. He said there was something about keeping the English alive that was going to sustain the Pokanoket. And Massasoit, had he wanted them dead, all he had to do was leave them alone, because they would not have known how to raise the corn that sustained them. So in the complexities that Matt talked about, please, if I say anything to you that you remember, as soon as someone tells you they're telling you the real story of something or that they are myth-busting, they are neither telling you the real story nor are they myth-busting, they are creating them. The work that we do as historians is one of constant questioning, looking at other people's lives, how they inform ours, and being gentle about it, holding the lives of people in the past as tenderly and as respectfully as we will want to be held 400 years from now. Thank you.
Our first respondent is Dr. Nicholas Rowe. Nicholas Rowe is an Associate Vice President for Student and Global Engagement and teaches in the History program at Gordon College. Previously, he and his family lived for 10 years in South Africa. As a historian in South Africa, he was the academic dean and also interim president of St. Augustine College of South Africa. As a historian of Atlantic cultural history, he considers how communities use the past to form their collective identities and how this fuels intergroup conflict. He has more than 20 years of consulting experience with communities about cross-racial and cross-ethnic reconciliation and pastoral counseling for reconciling communities in the U.S. and in South Africa. Thank you, Nick.
I want to thank the organizers of today's event for the invitation and the request for my response to the work of Dr. Riley, particularly in terms of his essay, which takes on a well-engaged subject. Not the first Thanksgiving per se, but its place in American memory and its deployment alongside the ideas of immigration, migration, and belonging. He also shows how this event enters the historical imaginations of various subgroups of the United States and how its meaning gets changed over time. I note he has accepted David Blight's challenge to resist the fears of certain historians about investigating memory, particularly the risks of falling down the slippery slope of post-structuralism. He has shown how we can think about memory and not with it. I appreciate the distance with which he has engaged the matter. As a scholar trained in history and peace studies, I pay close attention to identity-based conflicts and attempts to resolve them. Collective memory, that is, how groups engage and articulate their collective past, is essential in my work. Memory is not history. Memory refers to the stories and assumptions about the past that illustrate the priorities of the groups holding them. Historians construct narratives of the past based on critical examination of the evidence. Historians may have a consensus on matters, but that consensus can be subjected to revision if new evidence emerges. However, the makers and retainers of memory hold fast to their narratives, since it is often the foundation of collective identity. Challenging it can be an existential threat to being and belonging. History, on the other hand, to cite Blight again, tends to be critical and skeptical of human motive and action, and thus is more secular than memory. For the reasons I mentioned above, memory, quote, is often treated as a sacred set of absolute meanings and stories, possessed as the heritage or identity of a community, end quote. And those objects of memory, coincidentally a phrase coined by another respected historian of memory, Pierre Nora, are also sacred events. They're also sacred events, places, monuments, statues. On the other hand, historians take the context of events very seriously with all the complexities it brings. And so I want to thank Dr. Pickering. I wasn't sure if it was Dr. Pickering or not, but if not, then this is a prophetic action. Dr. Pickering, okay? Contribution is so significant, and I really want to thank you for your input. The context of the actual event is just as important to know as its deployment in memory. Given that understanding of the actual context, we see that memory takes the event, quote, out of context. It does not elaborate on the eventual conflict between the settler community, the immigrants, or the indigenous community. The removal of context also serves another purpose. The image of that first Thanksgiving illustrates more of a hope instead of the eventual disappointment to come. It was a celebration of a successful harvest and an indication of the future survival and potential cooperation between English immigrants and their native hosts. It also shows the hope of a coexistence between the Wampanoag hosts. Sadly, the historical record through the 19th century and beyond indicated anything but that. But this hope finds its resurrection with Thomas Nast's famous 1869 illustration from Harper's Weekly magazine, which I know Dr. Rowley also talked about. In his imagination, a white Uncle Sam presides over a table under the white Trinitarian presence of Washington, Lincoln, and Grant on the walls, with a female Trinitarian presence of Ladies Columbia, Liberty, and Justice. And by the way, Lady Columbia represents the personification of America's values and promise. He beckons Asian, Black, and Native American guests, along with marginalized European immigrants, with the invitation, come one and come all. It represents the optimistic, radical Republican ideal freshly attained in the wake of the American Civil War. It is a reimagining of the first Thanksgiving to shape memory of the ultimate white hope of a reality framed according to the ideals of white Americans becoming universal for all mankind. But then again, and once again, hope is betrayed by the realities of history. A bit of a warning here about the image I'm about to show. It may be mildly disturbing. Oh, did you reverse the order? All right, here's Nast. So you've seen Nast before, obviously we've seen it already, but again, right here. Right, so here's the second image. The same motif, the Thanksgiving meal, gets spoofed by George Frederick Keller in 1877 in the San Francisco Wasp. It is there to show that for his readers, Nash's hope is actually their nightmare. The attempts to bring all people to the table is a fool's errand and a waste of time. The guests reject the traditional American Thanksgiving meal in favor of the foods thought to be their preference, and the thinking has racial overtones. Columbia is not even at the table. She is sitting in the kitchen, having worked on the meal, and seeing nobody eating it is copying an attitude. The symbolic American Thanksgiving fare, the turkey, is presented on the platter by a black waiter. It is still alive, raw, for consumption not by a civilized Uncle Sam, but the one who has become a brute like the outsiders brought to the table. Who's influencing who? And finally, in this vision, there are no women and children as guests. Again, the context here is everything. Nash's vision comes in the wake of the optimism of radical republicanism, but Keller's nightmare appears in a Western publication, which probably is not even seen east of the Rockies, where at the time when the U.S. West roiled in anti-immigrant sentiment fueled by a significant anti-Asian and more specifically anti-Chinese animus. Let's bend the metaphor of Thanksgiving, of the metaphor of the Thanksgiving table a little bit more. Memory in service of group identity is like being invited to dine at the table set by history. The turkey, the sweet potatoes, and macaroni and cheese, never from a box, by the way, are there. But there will also be vegetables, which we might not want to eat because we don't like veggies. There are the things that historical evidence uncovers that memory does not want to retain, like the conflicts with indigenous groups, a racial anti-immigrant sentiment that Keller illustrates, or even its engagement with African Americans. If these veggies are sufficiently repulsive, we may jump straight to the comforting dessert of Nash's portrait, or that nice image of the original Thanksgiving meal. Often, memory reinforces a group's self-image, making it look good, better, more powerful, more advanced, and more civilized than competing groups in proximity. And if a group must engage disturbing historical realities, memory empowers the group to take it on its own terms. Memory is often very picky about what it takes from the table of the past and constantly wants to forget parts of the menu because the taste of guilt, shame, and vulnerability are too much to bear. At some point, memory jumps up from its position as a guest at the table and tries to shove history aside to redo the menu because memory is not just about identity but also power. The group in power seeks to set the menu. And right now, the United States is in a time where there is a debate about its official memory. And those who have determined the cultural agenda historically for the USA feel threatened. And by the way, this is not just an American unique development. The historical record contains numerous examples of this dynamic, and I've seen it firsthand in South Africa, in Rwanda, in Yugoslavia, in Quebec, in Northern Ireland. A final word on this. As much as memory can be problematic, we are disposed to memory. It is part of being human, and we are disposed to deploying it to preserve our group identities. However, when this disposition appears in the church, it must be subjected to practices of transformation and discipleship, like all our other instincts and propensities. History might be interpreted, but memory is owned. To quote Blight once more. We use it to define ourselves and groups, and to define who belongs and who does not, and to promote self-sufficiency and self-affirmation. But the church, the body of Christ, finds its definition by identification with and submission to the Creator and Redeemer who brings all things under his feet. Part of that submission is to admit our need for a Redeemer, to recognize our vulnerability and weaknesses, and confess that we are not self-sufficient. When any human group attempts to craft a reality employing its norms as the standard, it will always be limited. No human being, let alone a collective group, has the divine imagination and the beneficent ability to make it work. It will always depend upon its power control, and the fear of losing it will eventually harm its guests. We can never create security and shalom by taking control. Only the Creator can do this. And so, For believers, the natural impulse of memory for self-preservation cannot coexist with God's provision for our salvation. One must choose. In contrast to Nast's metaphorical illustration, which proved unsustainable, Christ is the host of this table. And to cite the famous plain song, he will give to all the faithful his own self for heavenly food. Thank you.
Our final respondent for this first panel of our symposium is Dr. Steve Alter, who has taught history at Gordon College for 21 years. He teaches U.S. history, modern British history, specializing in foreign relations and intellectual life. He's the author of Darwinism and the Linguistic Image, Language, Race, and Natural Theology in the 19th Century, and William Dwight Whitney and the Science of Language, both books published by Johns Hopkins University Press. He is currently researching American Old Testament scholars' engagement with biblical criticism and ancient Near Eastern archaeology, 1870 to 1940. Thank you, Steve.
It's great to be here. In the next few minutes, I will attempt to highlight some key points from Matthew Rowley's impressive essay about American identity. This essay gives a wide-ranging synthesis of the American experience, united by insights into the nation's multiple great migrations. The essay also presents an extraordinary review of recent historical literature concerning exploited or overlooked groups within American society. Much of what I say will relate to Matt Rowley's ultimate assessment, his view that our present day's discussion of American history could help promote racial reconciliation and a more inclusive society. Here I will give some reflections based on Matt's comments on the controversial 1619 Project, a reframing of American history that stresses the central role of race-based slavery. If we read between the lines, Matt's essay poses a question about the practical use of historical knowledge. How can a public that is better informed historically help to make America more accepting of its diversity? For nearly a century now, historians and others have been saying that societies need a usable past. This version of the past must be accurate, based on facts, and not given to distortion. Yet the point is that these facts should be selected and emphasized in ways that are useful for helping citizens to address present-day challenges. Matt Rowley makes a timely application of this theme by calling our attention to the flip side of the familiar saying that America is a nation of immigrants. For, as he points out, America is also a nation that has long sought to control migration. This idea is foreshadowed in the title of Matt's piece, which contains a play on words. The title, Many Great Migrations, Colonial History, and the Contest for American Identity. Colonial does not just apply to the colonial era, that is, to the 17th and 18th centuries. Matt's analysis begins with that period, yet it moves on to later times, and colonial applies here as well, to discrimination of one kind or another against Native Americans, Irish Catholics, and the people of the territories acquired in the Spanish-American War, that is, the Puerto Ricans and Filipinos. Each of these cases involved imperialistic power relations, colonialism, and certain people always held the upper hand. In other words, as Matt Rowley points out, someone has always had the power to decide who should be included at America's official Thanksgiving table. Matt also reminds us of the glaring inconsistency in the way American leaders of the Revolutionary period produced the world's most advanced philosophy of freedom, yet also, on the whole, supported the continuation of slavery. The continuance of slavery was, after all, at least provided for in the new United States Constitution. Historians have long noted this paradox, seen perhaps most pointedly in Edmund Morgan's classic book, American Slavery, American Freedom, a study of colonial era Virginia, the home of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Even so, another long-serving historian of the Revolution, Gordon Wood, has argued that the rhetoric of 1776 eventually took on a life of its own. In fits and in starts, the ideals of liberty and equality were made more expansive. They eventually were harnessed, for example, by Martin Luther King Jr., among many others. Gordon Wood thus argues that even ideals that were tainted at their inception by assumptions of European superiority could be and have in fact been applied in more consistent ways. Wood's point seems to me to be beyond question, although it should be added that this expanded application of old ideals has taken place only when certain people, that is, a committed minority, have pushed for such an expansion, making themselves a vanguard for change. On the subject of the 1619 Project, Matt Rowley rightly notes, and we heard earlier, that this recent set of writings, quote, tends to see modern problems baked into the nation from the beginning. And Matt says that this kind of analysis, quote, can lead to a crippling fatalism in the present. Others as well have called attention to and have faulted this pessimistic undercurrent in the 1619 essays. The reason for this pessimism, it strikes me, is that the 1619 writers mainly wanted to stress the ongoing problem, and they do this particularly in reply to the relative optimism of white liberals. Matt Rowley counters by pointing, as we heard earlier, to the alternative analysis offered by the writers Philip Gorski and Samuel Perry, who argue that racial oppression was not hardwired in the American DNA, but rather has been the product of human choices made at various specific moments. The problem, however, is that Gorski and Perry's own narrative shows how, in practice, it's all the same. Each moment of choice revealed whites closing ranks to create a more inclusively Euro-American national unity rather than seeking greater racial inclusion. Old stock Yankees thus became more welcoming of the Irish, of Southern Europeans, and of Jews, but not so much of non-Europeans. According to Gorski and Perry, one of these moments of disappointment came in the wake of the mid-20th century civil rights movement itself. This point fits with my own suspicion about what drives the thinking behind the 1619 Project, that the disillusionment of these writers stems from the record of racial tension and injustice in the decades since about 1965. Their focus on slavery in the colonial period, on the inconsistencies of the revolutionary leaders, and on the renewed oppression unleashed in the Jim Crow era, all is an effort to explain the slowdown in progress since the civil rights era. The project's underlying message is that there is still a problem deeply ingrained in white-led American culture, and that this reality still has not been fully dealt with. Matt Rowley concludes his essay, again as we heard, with a wonderful extension of the metaphor of the Thanksgiving table. I should have put this picture earlier. This is the lead author of the 1619 Project. I'll leave that there. Go on. It's not only a question, as far as the Thanksgiving table, it's not only a question of who gets invited to dinner, it's also a question of what can and cannot be talked about during the meal. Which topics, including historical topics, does everyone need to stay away from so as to avoid tension at the nation's table? I imagine that at least some of us here have experienced this challenge in our actual Thanksgiving dinners. At the same time that you chew your turkey, you also need to bite your tongue. Now, of course, there can be wisdom in sometimes biting our tongues. The problem, however, comes from a continual avoidance of hard topics, such that some important things never get said. And when that happens, we fail to learn from the mistakes of the past. Matt Rowley acknowledges the difficulty of engaging in national reflection and self-critique. For what if people find self-reflection uncomfortable and threatening? I also wonder if we Americans have the attention span required for national debates on any subject whatsoever. Certainly, our present political culture does not encourage it. Neither does the business model of the cable news networks, which is also the business model of social media. That model rewards the very opposite of judicious thinking, of intellectual honesty, and of careful listening to viewpoints other than one's own. I don't want to be pessimistic, yet I see little in our present culture encouraging critical reflection. Grown-ups rarely model it, and so my own hope increasingly rests with the young. I do believe that through the kinds of historical research being produced at present, the kind that Matt Rowley reviews in his essay, and through the teaching of that work, those who are a bit older can at least supply useful material to work with. That is, we can supply a usable past on which the young can build, both in their own scholarship and in their activism. Thank you.